She had a quiet grace about her, the kind the world notices only when it leans in. People in their neighborhood called her kind, reliable, the wife who always had a fresh pie on the windowsill. He called her his safety net, his secret insurance. For years it had been a strange arrangement. He would slip away, make a mess of his promises, and then come back with a check so large it stunned the bank teller. 10 million each time, he would say. 10 million and an apology that smelled faintly of impatience. Nobody imagined she would accept it forever. Nobody calculated the cost of living inside that gilded compromise. The money sat in an account with a neat name and a tidy line on spreadsheets. The truth sat heavier, bending her spine a millimeter at a time. She learned the clock of deception. She learned to watch for late returns and perfume on collars. She learned to laugh in front of friends so the shadow inside the house didn't look like a problem anyone could fix. Love and logic had become separate rooms in the same house. One was tidy and furnished while the other collected moths. He was good at explaining himself, polished in public and careless behind closed doors. His colleagues admired his charm, the way he could navigate a boardroom like a ship on calm water. Her friends envied the vacations and the house that sparkled like a postcard. But she knew the ledger of their marriage in a way no one else did. The balance of favors owed, the invisible currency of humiliation, and the checkbooks that paid for silence. The first time he handed her that giant sum, the idea felt obscene and impossible. She sat at the dining table, the paperweight catching light, and a check lay between them like a crossed baton. He spoke of forgiveness like it was a contract, of restarting like you can reboot a life. She signed the papers, not because she loved the numbers, but because she loved a person who still sometimes could be tender. The money felt like a bandage over something much deeper. It made their house livable. It bought them weekends on the lake and a school with small class sizes. But bandages hide wounds. They do not heal them. Over the years, those 10 million installments became a rhythm. He would promise change, then vanish, and the same ritual would repeat. She became skilled at making everything look normal. Her smile sharpened into a practiced curve that kept things quiet. She learned to knock out small emergencies with quiet phone calls, and to accept the checks because they meant security for her and their daughter. People called the arrangement pragmatic. People who did not live under the same roof could not see the ticking clock inside the kitchen drawer. There were moments that cut like glass. A school recital where she braided her daughter's hair and watched from the front row while he sat with other guests and did not meet their eyes. A holiday dinner where the table was set with care and he texted under the table. The comments started to feel less like slips and more like an economy of neglect. She started keeping a list of things money could not fix: trust, presence, apology that meant anything beyond words. But the world takes cues from the smallest changes. She started to say no to things that made her feel smaller. No more late-night calls to explain his whereabouts. No more second-guessing herself when a name came up in the wrong place. And yet she avoided the ruinous choice everyone expected: leaving. Leaving would have felt like burning down the bridge, and her life included more than himself. The house, the friend network, the safety of the known, all of that made staying a complicated moral investment. It reached a boil the night before the storm. He arrived home later than usual, smelling of a different cologne that did not belong to him or to any of his usual shirts. She had a note ready on the kitchen counter, not accusatory, simply a list of small facts she had collected like proof. Missed anniversary, broken promise, name on a receipt. She placed the paper with a hand that didn't shake and watched him read it. He smiled like a man who knows how to smooth cracks with money. He reached for his checkbook like a locksmith reaching for his tools. That night, she looked at the pen in his hand and the way the lamps made his jaw look softer. She let him talk. He apologized in his well-rehearsed cadence, offering again what had become the default: a sum that could purchase silence and normalcy. Her fingers rested on the check as if it were an object that belonged in another life. Then she did something nobody around her expected. She refused the money. The room rearranged itself. The check was still held between his fingers like a shield and an insult. "I don't want your money," she said, and the words landed like stones. He laughed, a sharp thing, not the charming laugh that made people forgive him in social circles. "What do you mean? Is this a game?" She shook her head. "I mean what I say. I won't take it." He tried to bargain, to blur the line, to promise better. She listened and did not flinch. She could have simply walked away after that. She could have taken their daughter, and left while he was bargaining on the linoleum. But her refusal was not a demand to be rescued. It was a reset of terms. When he asked what she wanted, she surprised him with an answer that did not appear in the playbook of betrayed wives. She didn't want revenge. She wanted to change the currency of their marriage. She started small. That week, she moved some of the money he had already paid into a separate account she controlled. A quiet housekeeper, an email to an accountant, a meeting at a bank where she learned the names that hid behind capital. She arranged for the money to be placed in a trust for causes she believed in, scholarships for girls from neighborhoods like hers, a small clinic that had once helped her mother, a shelter that taught job skills. The transfers were legal and precise. She never made a no. Word traveled in strange ways. In a city that liked rumors, stories morph into legends. He found himself meeting less applause at charity galas, his name mentioned less when donors whispered. She started speaking at small gatherings, community centers, PTA meetings, sharing lessons about dignity and autonomy without revealing the private ledger that funded the work. People were drawn to her simple authority. She had an intelligence for practical kindness and an eloquence that wasn't performative. His reaction was a complex mix of anger and bewilderment. Men like him are not accustomed to refusals that don't end in capitulation. He tried public charm, double apologies at expensive dinners. He tried to control the narrative by giving interviews about how he'd supported her projects. But she had already learned how to let money work for good instead of for silence. The tabloids hummed, but the stories about his indiscretions began to sound less powerful when contrasted with scholarships awarded in classrooms and the steady hum of the clinic. In private, the marriage grew colder. He pushed for reconciliation as if pressing a repeater button would restore equilibrium. She refused to return to a system where payments replaced accountability. Instead, she laid out new boundaries: transparency, counseling, presence, or else separation. He agreed, not because he understood, but because the public pressure made it easier than the alternative. They went to therapy for a while. The sessions were raw. The therapist asked the hard questions. Why had she tolerated the pattern? Why had he repeated it? What did fidelity mean beyond the printed page? Therapy taught them nothing if he didn't change. Change meant small, painful admissions repeated until they felt real. He could list the reasons he had strayed: boredom, ego, the intoxicating attention. But the reasons felt thin against the ledger of her years. He would have to show the work day after day. Meanwhile, she continued the work she had started with his checks, building programs that trained women in trades, sponsoring a tiny clinic, and setting up a legal fund for women who needed lawyers but couldn't afford them. There was a moment when their daughter, old enough to sense weightier things, asked why they argued so much. She explained in a way children understand. Some things that hurt can be fixed with promises, but some things need proof. The daughter watched her mother with new eyes, seeing that dignity sometimes requires refusal. She saw that love isn't the only thing worth preserving, self-respect is too. Then came the inevitable escalation. He began to feel the loss of power in a way that threatened his ego. He started to test boundaries again with small transgressions, hoping the old mechanisms might still work. Each time, she did something different. She would not take checks. She would not be bought back into complacency. Instead, she called him out publicly sometimes, not to humiliate, but to make him accountable. She had learned that secrecy is the soil where betrayal grows. The community noticed. People who once shrugged now nodded at her in recognition. Some men whispered bitterly about the woman who turned charity into a weapon. Some women approached her privately, thanking her for creating opportunities they could never have imagined. The clinic's waiting room filled, then overflowed, then expanded. Scholarships paid for study abroad, apprenticeships, and first salaries. The money became a tool of transformation rather than consolation. He tried a final gambit. He offered a public statement of remorse and a massive donation to one of her programs in a bid to regain control. It smelled like PR, and she refused to be a prop for his redemption. Instead, she accepted a meeting, sat across from him, and negotiated terms in daylight. She insisted on transparency, public accounting, governance structures, and independent oversight. If he wanted his name on anything, it would be attached to verifiable impact, not buried in press releases about his contrition. The negotiation that followed was less about money than principle. It exposed a fracture in their life that could not be smoothed by press statements. He wanted to salvage appearances. She wanted to salvage autonomy. That season taught her how to wield clarity like a blade. Precise, contained, and effective. They signed documents, made commitments, and when the ink dried it sounded like something more than words. It sounded like a new kind of contract. Months later, a silent, tidy transformation took place. He changed because the architecture around him shifted. The old rewards no longer insulated his choices. She became someone who refused to exchange dignity for comfort. She also became someone who could imagine a life outside the house of compromises. The marriage either matured or it did not. Either he learned to live with the cost of fidelity or she walked away. The resolution was messy and real, as real things often are. In the end, the city remembered how she had refused to be purchased. People told younger women the story in different versions. The moral tale, the feminist tale, the love-lost tale. For her, it was neither an anthem nor a sermon. It was simply the way she decided to live. She used the money to build something that outlived both the marriage and the gossip. She made a foundation that taught dignity through independence and paid for futures that could not be bought back with checks. He watched from the gallery of his own, making as the programs she funded changed lives. He sat at fundraisers in shirts that cost more than his father's car and realized generosity, without remorse, didn't heal what had been broken. When the last check came and she refused it as always, he felt something like liberation, not because he could buy his way out of a mistake, but because the proving ground had shifted. He found himself confronting what he'd been avoiding, the need to become better, not richer. The real victory was quiet. It existed in a girl who went to school because the scholarship paid for a uniform, in a mother who got medical help without fearing the bill, in a graduate who opened a small bakery because the training program taught her how to run a business. Those were the things that made the ledger finally tilt, not by sums of money, but by the force of lives altered. The checks stopped meaning the same thing because their recipients had changed the story. When people ask her now why she didn't run the moment she first learned of his betrayals, she smiles in a way that is not meant to be poetic. Leaving wasn't the only way to win, she says. Sometimes the best answer is to change what that money can buy. The line is simple, radical, and true. She took an offer intended to silence and repurposed it to amplify voices that had been quiet for too long. There is no cinematic finale, no perfect redemption. There are small days stitched together by choices that mattered more than convenient comfort. The husband still learns, still stumbles sometimes, but the pattern that once defined them has been disrupted. She teaches a new standard by example. In a world that often trades apology for cash, she found a better currency, purpose. And when she refused those 10 million checks, she didn't just refuse a man. She refused the old rules. In the quiet of the clinic on a Tuesday afternoon, she watched a young woman accept a certificate for training that would mean a first paycheck, a first life beyond dependence. She felt the long weight lift like an exhale. There was grief, yes, grief for what marriage could have been, but there was also a large, steady contentment. Money had been the language of compromise. She had translated it into the language of possibility. The story that began with betrayal had become one about agency. The house with its pie on the windowsill was still there, but so was the map of a different life, one she drew herself. And when someone asked the husband in a rare, honest moment if he regretted the years he'd tried to buy forgiveness, he paused. He could name the emptiness of checks lined up like apologies, and for the first time he could not dismiss the quiet work that had permanently altered their lives. He understood, finally, that some acts demand more than money. Dignity requires action, repair, presence. The money had been only a mirror. She had used it to build better things. The city kept telling the tale, in gossip and in reverent tones. But those who knew her saw something simpler. A woman who refused to be silenced and chose to refashion the terms of her life. She had been paid 10 million before, and she had turned it into 10 million reasons for other women to stand. It was the most beautiful kind of refusal, one that created doors instead of burning them. It was a refusal that taught everyone who watched how power can be shifted quietly and irreversibly when dignity is the measure of value. It became her answer,